Everybody, and welcome to the third video in our inflation series. Now, in the earlier videos, we talked about inflation being the rate at which prices are changing, usually measured either monthly or yearly. How much have prices changed in the last month, or how much have they changed in the last year? And when we have a national inflation number, like they say inflation is 4%, they're talking about overall inflation usually, which includes things like food costs and gas costs and rents or mortgage costs. All those things are sort of lumped together and weighted into one number. Now, of course, it could be true that, at any given time, prices for some things are going up while prices for other things are going down. So maybe, in the last month, gas prices have gone down, but grocery prices have gone up. Or gas prices have gone down, but rents have gone up. And so the inflation number gauges the overall effect of all of that, including things that may have gone down and things that may have gone up. So when you see inflation is 4%, and that's the national number they advertise, that doesn't mean that everything's gone up that much in that period of time. It means that some things have probably gone up more and some things less. But on a weighted average, that's sort of the overall picture for the average consumer. Now, where the Federal Reserve organization is comfortable, that's the organization that's tasked with sort of keeping inflation in a reasonable window for the United States. Where they're comfortable is when the inflation rate is like 2 to 3%. I think they prefer probably a little closer to 2. But, that's sort of their comfort zone for inflation. They don't like to see no inflation because Federal Reserve folks feel that when there's zero inflation, or even when there's negative inflation, when there's deflation, when prices are going down, they feel like that's happening because the economy is not doing well. They feel like if the economy is doing well and there's low unemployment and people are getting hired, that generally people have money to spend and wages will naturally increase, so prices will naturally increase, and so they do want to see some increases, but they get uncomfortable if there is no increase, and they also get uncomfortable if the increase is too high, if it starts to get significantly above 3%. So the Federal Reserve targets inflation by, if the inflation is too high, if it gets like 3.5%, 4% or higher, then what the Federal Reserve usually wants to do, in fact, pretty much always wants to do, is what they can do about that, which is to raise interest rates, which increases the cost of borrowing money for everyone, including banks. And when that happens, when it's more expensive to get loans, then economic activity tends to slow down. People don't buy as many homes, people don't buy as many cars, businesses don't buy as much equipment, and we don't start as many new businesses because it's just more expensive to do it. And so they feel like that slowdown in economic activity is going to reduce inflation because basically it's going to lead to people losing their jobs or their wages not going up. And so they're not going to be able to afford to spend more on stuff. So it's almost a deliberate way of creating what's called a recession, which is a period of higher than normal unemployment. So basically, Fed policy is to, when there's inflationary pain, is to counteract it by causing recessionary pain and putting people out of work. Now, of course, when people are out of work, they have a harder time finding jobs and they can't negotiate for their salaries as well. When employers aren't having trouble finding people to fill jobs, and when people are having trouble getting jobs, they're not going to be too fussy about how much they're earning, usually. And so that works against wage increase. Now, why am I going through all that? Well, because today's topic is why haven't wages matched inflation for the last 50 years in the United States? In our previous videos, we've talked about how, the last 50 years in the United States has been quite inflationary. Under both Democratic and Republican administrations, costs of stuff has gone up a lot. And in our second inflation video, we talked about some of the factors that made costs go up, like more people chasing fewer natural resources, energy getting more expensive, businesses shifting their focus to stockholder value rather than employee satisfaction or customer satisfaction. But what we didn't talk about in the last video is why wages have not kept up with the increasing costs over the last 50 years. So costs have increased a lot for a number of reasons, which we went over in video 2. But why didn't wages over that same time period keep up with those additional costs? How are businesses, in other words, able to get away with paying people less, even though the people themselves were paying more for the things they needed? So there's a number of answers, just like there were a number of answers to the inflation question, why prices have been going up so much. There's a number of answers to the wage question, why wages have not been keeping up. And one of those answers I have on here is Federal Reserve policy. Since there has been a fair lot of inflation over the last 50 years, we've gone through a number of inflationary periods in the last 50 years where the Fed has responded by raising interest rates to essentially create recessions, to bring inflation down. And for the most part, they've been successful at bringing inflation down during those brief periods by creating recessions. But when you create a recession, you depress wages. So that's one effect of a recession, is there aren't many jobs. People are desperate for jobs. A lot of people are out of work. And so people can't really bargain much for their wages. They have to just take what they're given. And usually businesses use those times as a way as a period that they can hold wages constant or even drop them for work. So U.S. Federal Reserve policy is actually one reason why wages have not kept up with inflation, because when there is inflation, Federal Reserve policy actually depresses wages. So, and that's bad for workers. I mean, as prices are going up for things, the way that's being fought is in a way that takes people's wages down and makes them even less able to afford things. So I have my issues with this sort of method of fighting inflation. I know it's standard economic policy, it's canon, and it works to some extent. But, are you not just, when you do this, trading one bad for another, maybe even worse bad? And that's something we definitely have been doing for the last 50 years. So this is one answer to that question. Another answer is on the worker side. Way fewer workers today are unionized. That is, a much lower percentage of U.S. workers today are unionized than were unionized 50 years ago, say in 1970. Which 1970 was about the peak of unionization in the United States. And at that time, nearly 1 in 3 U.S. workers were in a union. Today, it's more like 1 in 10 U.S. workers. So unionization has dropped by almost 2/3 among workers in the United States over the last 50 years. And that's a lot. And I mean, the advantage to unionization is workers can do things, who are in unions, can do things called collective bargaining. So collective bargaining means that things like wages and benefits are bargained for by union leaders on behalf of the entire membership. So it's not like a business can pick and choose and say, well, this person we're going to give a lot more to, and these other people we're just going to let go. When you have a unionized workforce, a benefit to one becomes a benefit to all. and it becomes much harder actually to do things because, like, lay off folks for en masse, because also often union contracts make that hard to do. So most union contracts not only include wage and benefit increases, but also make it harder to fire people. So with the loss of unionization, there are fewer protected workers in the U.S., which means most workers are pretty much on their own when it comes to things like wages and benefits. You know, they either take what they're given by the company when they're hired, or they, bargain, but only on their own behalf. It's like they have to go and say, well, I think I deserve more, and then justify it to their higher ups who sign their paychecks. And, when it's just one person doing that, the business really, unless that person is super critical to business operations, the business folks don't usually feel the need to agree to that demand from that individual. They could always just fire that individual and hire somebody younger and, more desperate, more willing to work hard for less money. So without the unionization protections, without the collective bargaining, workers are at a much bigger disadvantage here as far as, getting their wages and benefits increased. So loss of unionization has definitely been a factor in depressing wages over the last 50 years. Federal Reserve policy has been a factor in depressing wages over the last 50 years. We talked in the second video about how companies prioritize their stock value now over things like customer satisfaction or employee satisfaction. And part of improving stock value is improving the profitability of the company. And one thing that makes companies more profitable is paying their workers less. So, replacing older, maybe better paid workers with younger, less well-paid workers, that's good for stock value because it's good for company profitability. And so that reprioritization has led to a great resistance among corporate and business leaders to actually increase wages. In fact, their priorities these days are really to decrease wages in the aggregate, particularly for folks lower down in the employee scale. There is a federal minimum wage. I think most of you know that. There's a minimum amount that employers can pay employees nationwide that's set by the federal Congress. And federal Congress has historically been very, very reluctant to raise this. Up until recently, it hardly increased at all in 50 years. Now, more recently, it's increased quite a bit, actually. And a number of states have actually implemented their own minimum wage, which is significantly higher than the federal minimum wage. My state of California has a minimum wage now, I think, of $18 an hour, which is way higher than the federal minimum wage. So, although this has been true historically for the last 50 years, and it's helped depress wages because businesses haven't legally had to increase wages much. Lately, this has been changing. Particularly, it was changed during COVID, because during COVID, a lot of employers found themselves without workers. Workers didn't want to work in these particular conditions, when it became much more dangerous to work, and they weren't getting paid anymore. So a lot of people quit, and the government was actually supplying some pretty generous benefits to people who were out of work, so people could afford to quit. That skewed the system a bit, where all of a sudden businesses couldn't even find enough workers to carry on the normal business that they needed to. And that was starting to hurt their bottom line. They couldn't get things made and sold because they just didn't have the workers to do it. So during that time, the federal minimum wage increase and states implemented much higher minimum wages to help fix that. So that really did help. And over the last few years, wages have gone up much more significantly in the United States. Even this last year, wages increases actually have outstripped inflation for the first time in quite a long time in the U.S. Another thing that historically over the last 50 years has depressed wages is that our country, unlike pretty much any other developed nation, has shifted the cost burden for health care coverage from the government or individuals to employers. In other words, we've asked a lot of our employers to cover at least some of the cost of their workers' health benefits. And that's put a real financial burden on employers. And it's made it so that employee health benefits are a significant part of employee compensation now. So businesses have mostly responded to that by, we're giving employees some health benefit, but we're going to take away their wage. So we're going to actually reduce their wage to compensate for what we're spending on their health benefit. Now this is a very weird system, and it has the practical effect of depressing wages because some of the wage now goes into the health benefit cost. I think we really need to have a national discussion about whether having businesses pay for workers' health care is a better system than having government pay for workers' health care, in other words. Or individuals paying for their own care. So, this is presumably if we ended this system and let's say shifted to the government as the primary payer of everyone's health care, that would free up business capital, and they could, although they probably wouldn't, but they could use that extra money that they suddenly have and are not paying benefits. They could use it to increase wages for workers. Now, my feeling is businesses won't do that because of this thing up here. Businesses wouldn't do that unless they were forced to. So you'd have to not only take away that healthcare burden from business, but you'd actually have to mandate in law that they shift some of that, at least some of that cost to worker wages, if you really want to see worker wages increase. But theoretically, that could be done. Two things that they often talk about when they talk about depressed wages over the last 50 years is the last 50 years have been a time of offshoring and tremendous increases in electronic and computer-based efficiencies. So we've got offshoring, we've got automation. Jobs that used to have to be done by people, particularly a lot of manufacturing jobs, can now be done by machines that are controlled by sophisticated computer systems. And sophisticated computer systems can also do some non-manufacturing jobs that were formerly given to humans. For example, computers are very good now at writing computer code. They can essentially write their own code. And so even in the white-collar jobs like computer science, jobs that were normally given to entry-level computer scientists writing new code, relatively straightforward code for programs, can now actually be done by the program itself. Doesn't need to be done by people at all. So there's been a lot of automation, which has taken away jobs and given human jobs to machines. Machines, from a business perspective, have the advantage that they don't ask for higher wages. In fact, you don't have to pay them at all, although you do have a cost associated with the machine. So machines aren't free. There's a cost of developing them, cost of building them, cost of installing them, and a cost of maintaining them. So, but in general, that cost is less than the cost of workers, doing all those jobs. We've also, of course, done a lot of offshoring in the last 50 years, a lot of shifting of American jobs, again, particularly manufacturing jobs, to other countries where labor is cheaper. You can have assembly line workers in the United States build things at $12 an hour or whatever per worker, or you can have assembly line workers in South Korea or even China do that same job for $2 an hour. And if you can have workers assemble things for $2 an hour, and even if you go to like Southeast Asian countries like Myanmar, let's say, or Burma, and you can build a factory there and have workers do the same thing at $1.20 an hour, 80 cents an hour, then you're saving an awful lot on worker pay. And of course, you don't have to, if you're an American company, you don't have to provide any benefits for workers over there. So you're saving a lot there too, and saving enough where you can actually, it's cheaper just to let them build it and then import it. It does cost money to ship these things overseas, but not as much as it costs to pay lots of workers 10 or 20 or 50 times more to build things. So the offshoring of jobs, the automation of jobs, both of which have been big things over the last 50 years, has really depressed the manufacturing sector. This has particularly hit the manufacturing sector in the United States, and just hollowed out these Midwestern states that used to be heavy manufacturing states like Michigan and Pennsylvania and Ohio. I mean, all these upper Midwestern states that used to rely, where workers used to rely on those manufacturing jobs, and those jobs just, they've been automated and offshored away. They're just not there anymore. So areas that used to have good jobs that provided a good living wage are now hollowed out with essentially no work, high unemployment locally, nothing for no good jobs for people to do. So one last thing, because folks bring it up a lot, is illegal immigration. There's, as everybody knows, there's a lot of industries in the United States that use they're heavy in illegal immigrant labor. The hotel industry, for example, the agricultural industry, the food service industry, home care industries, gardening, landscaping, all kinds of, and construction too. All of these industries are heavily reliant on illegal immigrant labor, and the advantage from the folks supervising that work is, and the businesses that control those industries, is you get cheap labor. You can pay immigrants even sometimes less than minimum wage, because what are they going to say? They're not here legally. They can't really complain about it. And you can also provide, substandard, unsafe working environments, which are cheaper to provide than safe, standard working environments. Because again, people aren't going to complain about it. You can overwork people, you can use child labor, you can mandate 16-hour work days, not really, obviously not legally mandate, but you can essentially tell workers they got to work 12 or 16 hours or they don't get to work. So, there's definitely reduced wages in these fields because this form of labor is available in these fields and it's commonly used. So, that's bad. And also the exploitation of workers is bad. But there is an upside to this that most people don't think about, which is that in the fields where a lot of illegal labor is used, the goods and services that are provided cheaply. In other words, we have cheaper food and we have cheaper services because of this available labor pool. If this labor pool weren't available, for example, if we say deported all illegal immigrants tomorrow, suddenly you'd find a lot of industries without workers. there would not be enough American workers to replace them. And so things just wouldn't get done, and the things that did get done would be much more expensive. So food would become very rapidly much more expensive. Various services would become much more expensive. So there would definitely be, you'd notice some real downsides if we got rid of that one. Okay, so all of these things have contributed to depressed wages over the last 50 years. Now, I couldn't tell you which ones had a stronger effect. I think it depends on which industry you're looking at and where. But for example, in the upper Midwest, these two things probably have had a huge impact, much more than these other things. But in other sectors, in other parts of the country, some of these other things have actually had a much bigger impact in depressing wages. But all of them have combined to depress wages naturally and to keep them lower than they should be, given how expensive everything's gotten, given that the inflation rate over the last 50 years has been way higher than the wage increase rate. And that's led us to the situation that we have now, where people today, particularly younger folks, are suffering because their wages are just not adequate to give them a decent lifestyle given how much stuff costs. And again, I think, you know, a lot of the fault here is my generation, baby boomers. The generation before mine, so they call it the greatest generation, it was the World War II Great Depression generation. They, because of what they lived through, all that trauma that they lived through early in their lives, they probably as a whole were more devoted to making life better for their children. You know, to sacrificing their own needs to make sure that things were better for their kids. My generation was the fruit of that, you know, effort. We benefited from that effort. And as a result, I'm not saying this for everybody, but just as a generalization, the lives of the baby boomer generation were easier than the lives of their parents because their parents made it that way. They were devoted to that idea. And so we got a little spoiled and a little selfish, and we didn't take the same attitude toward our children. It was more about us and less about, not about what we could sacrifice for our kids as much as it was about maximizing our stuff, maximizing our income, maximizing our wealth. You know, and not thinking so much about our kids. I think most of us pretty much assumed that if we maximize our wealth, our kids would have the ancillary benefit of, the knock-on benefit of, you know, getting some of our money eventually, either because we get them, buy them things, or, you know, because they'd inherit it. But that didn't really turn out to be the case, because on our watch is when most of this stuff happened, and we just sort of let it happen, you know, because along the way, most of these things helped us. For example, this offshoring and automation, they made stuff cheaper that we bought. You know, to some extent, at least that's how we were sold on it. And, you know, we elected people who, like, for example, Bill Clinton, who were really in favor of this stuff, of offshoring and automation. See, it's not all Republicans or all Democrats. There were Democrats heavily involved in this and Republicans heavily involved in this. So, like I said, this has been going on under many administrations, both Democrat, and Republican, conservative and liberal. In fact, the whole neoliberal movement, which was sort of personified by Clinton, was actually very into a lot of this stuff, like offshoring and automation, which really hurt American workers and depressed American wages. So what do we do about all this? Well, in my opinion, and again, this is just my opinion, I think it'd be easier in the long run to improve wages than to take away all the factors that influence inflation. Now, I could be wrong about that. Maybe it's just easier to try to keep inflation low. But given that our main policy for keeping inflation low is raising interest rates, which actually depresses wages, I don't think so. I think we need to focus on the wage side and how to improve wages. Part of that is going to might be taking a look at alternative ways the Federal Reserve can deal with inflation. Part of it is making it easier for workers to unionize. Part of it could be raising the federal minimum wage substantially. Although a lot of people argue when you raise wages substantially, you contribute to inflation because now people have more money to spend and they're willing to spend more on stuff, and that's true. But that so-called demand side inflation, where inflation goes up because people have more money to spend and they feel better about spending it, doesn't tend to be that bad for the economy, right? And I think people would appreciate having more money to spend, even if it did cause indirectly some price increases. So I think making it easier for workers to unionize, significantly raising federal minimum wage. And as far as these things go, I don't think there's much we can do about automation. Technology grows as it grows. We don't have a lot of control over it. As far as offshoring goes, we have a fair amount of control over that. One thing that presidents have done to reduce offshoring, or at least to make it less profitable, is to impose high tariffs, that is, extra surcharges on the importation of goods. Of course, the problem is which reduces it makes the cheap labor overseas not so cheap, right? Because it costs more to bring that stuff back to the United States. The problem with that, of course, is that when you get into these big tariffs, you tend to start tariff wars internationally, where we put a tariff on you, so you retaliate by putting a tariff on us, and then that kills our export businesses because now they don't want to buy our goods, just like we're not buying theirs, and that can get into a bad situation unless you really can bring back all that manufacturing, all those jobs to the U.S. and just have us do all our own stuff again. I don't realistically see that happening, although it is happening more now because COVID disrupted supply chains globally, and we got a taste of how vulnerable we were to getting a lot of the stuff we needed manufactured overseas. And so we have, since the beginning of COVID, over the last 4 years, brought back some real manufacturing to the United States, just so we can't be, so if we were not so vulnerable to other countries shutting down their manufacturing plants. During COVID, a lot of countries just shut down their manufacturing because it wasn't safe. Putting a bunch of workers into a plant got everybody sick and dying in early COVID. So plants shut down all over the world, and that led to a huge disruption in manufacturing globally. And we realized, because all of a sudden our shelves were running out of stuff that people needed, because a lot of that stuff we imported, and it just wasn't being made anymore. So that led us to reduce our offshoring. So we actually have been doing that naturally since COVID. We've been bringing jobs back, bringing manufacturing back to the U.S., and I think there's probably some real benefit to that, including better jobs and better wages in the manufacturing sector. Now, as far as this last one goes, because this one is the one that politicians tend to harp on a lot, although truthfully, it's not as big a deal in the economy as far as depressing wages as most of these other things are. But for this particular one, there is actually, you could try to deport 6 million, illegal folks from the United States disrupt several industries at once, make prices way higher, talk about it contributing to inflation. This would contribute to inflation. But, if you really wanted to address this seriously, an easier way to do it, rather than trying to find and deport 6 million people, would be to just really crack down on businesses that hire illegal labor. You could pass laws where businesses would be heavily fined, and business leaders and managers and CEOs could face jail time if they, try to use significant illegal labor in their business. And they're actually, back under George W. Bush, there was a proposal to do that, to really legally, federally crack down on businesses that hire illegal labor. But of course, that law was never passed. Businesses lobbied heavy against it. And, you could make the argument that it would, in the end, again, have a bad effect on the economy, but would be much easier to implement if you really wanted to control this. Controlling it from the business leadership end would be much easier to implement than trying to actually deport millions of people. So that's my take on the wage situation, why wages just have not kept up with inflation over the last 50 years. But if we really want to make our economy work for everybody again and not sort of screw the younger generations, we're going to need to address some of these things because our younger kids are just suffering. I was a teacher at college for 33 years, and most of my students were in the 18 to 24 age range, so just starting out in their adult lives. And, I saw what the heavy financial and debt burden was doing to them. It was really wrecking them financially, in some cases leading them into, dangerous or illegal activities, just out of desperation for money to do actual, real constructive things that they wanted to do, like finish school, get a degree, live in a nice place away from their parents. I've seen the effect of this, the effect of my generation not allowing this to happen. In fact, electing people who supported most of these policies and, at the expense of our kids. It's time that we gave back to our kids, not by trickling down our wealth to them, but by actually creating a society that has better wages, much more living wage-based society where, they're making enough to really afford on their own to do the things that they want to do. So that's my 2 cents on that. And that'll conclude our inflation and wages series of podcasts. So thanks for listening.